Hi there. Let's look at our next topic in section 2, which is understanding all the different plant organs. So in this section, we're going to leave out flowers because we're going to look at flowers and reproduction at a later topic. But I'm going to cover how roots, stems, and leaves work. And some of the processes that we'll look at are diffusion, osmosis, water uptake, photosynthesis, and food transport, transpiration, and stomata. Plants have a fairly simplified organ system, unlike humans, where humans have several different organ systems and they work sort of together. We have digestive organs, we have organs for our circulatory system like the heart, we have organs for breathing like our lungs. However, plants really only have 4 major organs. And so we're going to look at how roots work, we're going to look at how the stem helps a plant, we're going to look at how leaves, and then, as I said before, later on in a further topic, we'll discuss how flowers and fruits and seeds help in reproduction. So here they are again, the major parts to a plant. So roots help absorb water and the nutrients dissolve, and they also have a second function, so 2 functions. They work to help anchor the plant, and a third function that a root might play is sometimes they help store food. Store food. Let's go on to the stem of a plant. It provides a transport system or a pathway for the movement of water up through xylem and food down through phloem. And it's like the skeleton too of the plant. It helps support and hold on to the leaves and any other reproductive structures that the plant might have. Let's talk about the purpose of why plants have leaves. Leaves are the site of photosynthesis, so they produce food, and they also are the breathing mechanism for the plant. So it's almost like leaves are responsible for energy production, food production, and breathing. So they take in and release oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they also allow water to leave. Next, let's talk about flowers. In some plants, not all plants produce flowers, but some plants do. We call plants that produce flowers angiosperms. Those are the flowering plants. Kind of a fancy name for that. And flowers are the reproductive organ for plants, and we'll look at them in topic 3. In general, though, let's talk about how a plant grows up. Germination is the term we use for how a plant starts from seed and grows up to be an adult. And there are 3 things necessary for a plant to germinate. One is water, so it helps activate parts in the seed. A second thing they need is oxygen. And a third thing is suitable warmth. Notice a seed doesn't need sunlight. Seeds start out in the ground usually, and sun is not one of the ingredients for germination. Neither is soil. Soil isn't necessary. We could grow seeds in paper towel and they would be fine for germination. Here is the process of germination. The first thing you'll notice when a plant germinates is the root will come out regardless of the orientation of the seed. In other words, the seed could be like this, and the root will come out upward, and then it'll go down. That's called gravitropic, which means gravity forces it downward. Next, the root will start to grow little hairs called root hairs. And then you'll get the tiny embryo leaf. You'll see the cotyledon, which is basically part of the seed that is giving food and nourishment to the tiny little seed as it's germinating. Seeds don't photosynthesize yet, and so they need some food source, and that comes from the cotyledon. As soon as the cotyledon falls off, now the leaves will start to photosynthesize, and the plant's on its own now for food production. And that's usually when we say germination's over. And now we need to provide not only water, okay, remember germination, what does it need? It needs water, it needs oxygen, so O2, oxygen, and it needs warmth. But that's it. No sunlight, not necessarily soil. However, once that cotyledon falls off, now it also needs sun to help it photosynthesize and make food. So let's talk about roots. There's usually two types of roots. One is a taproot. Taproots are long and they dig deep into the soil. And they're usually for plants that are adapted for environments that there isn't a ton of water. And so they have to develop these huge taproot systems. However, some plants have these fibrous roots, and in fibrous roots, they don't go very deep. They're more towards the surface. So fibrous roots are for plants that live in very high water environments, like the tropical rainforests and so on. Let's talk about different kinds of stems. So the function of the stem is to transport water and nutrients. Also acts as a skeleton or support system to hold up all the different parts like the leaves, and sometimes food storage. So, we'll get into that later. Let's focus in again on the root. And one of the things that we need to understand is how water gets into the roots. In general, the process of diffusion is the spreading of a water particle from where they're high concentrated, which is down here, out to where there's low concentration. So low concentration means not crowded. High concentration means they're crowded. So if I open up a bottle of perfume in the room, it will diffuse or spread out. However, osmosis is a more specific type of diffusion. And osmosis involves the movement of water, and it's through a semi-permeable membrane. In other words, a barrier that has holes in it, like a filter paper, or our skin is a semi-permeable membrane. And in the case of plants, the root hairs have a membrane that blocks soil particles, but they allow other particles in, like water. So how does water go from the soil into the plant through the roots? Through osmosis, we say. And how does this happen? Well, you have to have water in high concentration, like the soil, and it has to be in low concentration inside the plant. If that occurs, if water's crowded in the soil or outside the plant and not crowded inside the root, then water will soak into the root. Okay, it'll soak up through osmosis. Here's what it looks like again. Here's where water is in high concentration, so it's going to move to the other side. Once it does, we say it's in equilibrium, and then it'll go back and forth. One will go over, one will, they'll exchange. So water's moved through osmosis in the roots, especially the tiny little root hairs, and then once it reaches the stem, it goes into something called the xylem column. Xylem columns are really narrow, and they hold they're so thin, they hold a few water particles at a time, almost like a one-way highway. And so all these water particles jam in here, and they head up the the plant. Eventually, they get to the leaves, and in the leaves, they jump into the air through evaporation. We call that transpiration. So let's talk about what happens when they're inside a xylem column. It's called capillary action. A capillary in our bodies is really narrow. And in the case of plants, they stick to each other, the water, so that gravity doesn't pull them down. We say water is very adhesive, or it has cohesive or sticking properties, so that it can defy gravity and move upward toward the leaves. So osmosis in the roots. Once it reaches the stem, it hops into a xylem column, and up it goes, up, 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 thanks to capillary action, the sticking and the holding on. And then once it gets to the leaves, it jumps or leaves or evaporates. We call that transpiration at the leaves. Now, one thing I haven't talked about yet, this kind of seems silly. What's the point? Comes into the soil, goes into the roots, up the xylem column, and then leaves. Well, why did it go into the plant in the first place? Well, nutrients that plants need are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They usually hitch a ride on the water. They're a little smaller. They get in and they'll jump off this system along the way to help in plant growth. Here it is again. Here's a good picture of capillary action. You can see the tubes are really small, xylem columns. Let's talk about phloem. Phloem is the column or transport system for food. Food is made in the leaves, and then it's usually stored either in the trunk or possibly in the roots. And so usually phloem goes down carrying sugar that's made in the plant. Phloem is usually on the outer part of the trunk. If you were to cut this trunk in half, you'd see it close to the bark. Phloem columns are sap. So you've seen probably sap coming out of a tree. That's the sugar. So food is made in the leaves and it's transported down through phloem. Water is brought in through the roots and it's transported or pulled. It's pulled up through the xylem column. And the more leaves a tree has, the more the water evaporates and the faster the transport system. So let's look at this. Here's some pure water inside a beaker, and this is sugar solution. This sugar solution has a membrane, a selectively or semi-permeable membrane. The water is going to go from where it's crowded or in high concentration outside, and it's going to osmose into the sugar bag. If we let this sit for a whole day, what would we notice about the bag of sugar? It would balloon up or swell up thanks to osmosis. Sugar's too big to leave. So technically sugar in here is high concentration. Outside it's low concentration. So it should go into the beaker, but it can't because it's too big and it's blocked by the membrane. So within 24 hours, if we came and visited this bag of sugary water, we'd notice it swelled up thanks to osmosis. Let's look at these pictures. What's this trying to teach us? If we take a celery stick, celery has xylem columns in it, and eventually it will soak up the water. Let's make the water colored, like red. And let's compare if the celery stalk had leaves compared to if the celery stalk had no leaves. What would we notice after 24 hours? The red dye or the red water would transport way faster up the xylem columns because of the leaves. Remember, water's evaporating quicker from the ends here. So the more leaves, the faster the transport system. Let's look at this picture. What's this showing you? If we stuck a bag over top of a leaf, what would happen after 24 hours? There would be water droplets on the inside of the bag, and that would prove that water is evaporating through the process of transpiration from the leaves. How does it do this?